partnerships, which also work to our advantage. There's too much work that we're doing with SAPS. The relationship is wonderful. There's that great trust between us, the CPF, Community Policing Forums. We are supporting their Victim Support Center, dealing with issues of schools, bullying. There's a lot of problems in our schools. There's drug issues. So as CWP, we are planning to have an intensive program to fight those behaviors of young people. But that cannot be done in silos, because we need to include parents as well. The SAPS are part of the Community Policing Forum. When you have the CPF, eventually you will find police in that group, because CPF will never work in isolation with SAPS. So it's sort of like an alliance. It's SAPS, it's the Policing Community Forum, and CWP. The issues of xenophobia, issues of crime, issues of rape as well, then those are the issues that we make sure that they are actually tackled within those structures.
We are dealing with so many types of crimes, but for them, they are dealing with those who are victims of crime, like the abuse of children, the abuse of women.
CWP is part of the volunteers that are working here in Orange Farm Police Station. Gana le di missing persons tse ngata ka mona Orange Farm, bana ba lahlea, batho ba bagolo ba lahlea. Re le maponisa Orange Farm ga bana le bothata, because a re tsebe community ya Orange Farm, ha re phele Orange Farm hangata. But ka CWP ba kgona hore ba tsebe batho ba dula kae, and then go ba easy for rona hore re bue le CWP if batho ba lahlehile.
I can say the relationship, on the side of the relationship, they are assisting us a lot to communicate with the community. Specifically, let me put it straight, because we are having those who are working with us in the office of the Victim Support Center.
Report domestic violence. Not to say banibasa report domestic violence because it's because motuna ka domestic violence, but as aware hore o ka hara domestic violence. But go ba easy for rona re tswe ka ntle le CWP go bua le community about the domestic violence. Re ba jwetse hore if o le ka hara domestic violence, what to do. When I batho ba re buang outside, ha ba tsebe hore what to do after rape.
There are patrollers that engage CWP participants as well. We do street patrolling. In the morning we do scholar patrolling, where there have been a lot of markings as well. In the morning, when people are going to taxis, we strategically place with the CP, with the Community Policing Forum, with people, we place them in those strategic places whereby we know that there's too much crime, and then that visibility has reduced crime. Snatch and grab, it's on the increase, but we are going to have a plan on how to combat that. We have a program that is called Corner to Corner. We did not go into the program and identify problems first. We observed what is happening. That's why we are got involved with SAPS. We say there are people that are rehabilitable. We can rehabilitate these people. With regards with the program that Big Boy is running through CWP, we had to establish trust first with the communities, because Big Boy is an ex-offender, but through CWP people found comfort in approaching such people. It started with assisting the elderly, because you find elderly people would never, the fence will be broken. Then people will go around and then find other ex-offenders move from jail. Then we started the group, and then we said, big boy, that is your team. In these instances, in order to beat drugs, you need to have people that understand the addiction. I've never been addicted into drugs, but through the experience that I've worked with people that are addicted, I could now relate to the experience that I have. Now integrating them into CWP and fighting this carnage of drugs, fighting the issue of drugs addiction, it has become easy for us as CWP to say, let's integrate them into the program. Let's fight together, because they can fight better than us, because they've suffered enough.
Mina ngifika kwami ku-CWP ngifike vele sengidiscoverile ukuthi into ezibhaya zimoshekile lifini yabo. Benginganaphile kukukhula nje nobustunt, understand. Kawo saflek namashit indanda sinkawuzile kakhulu, sashamachari wenyawupe yabona ezifana nalezo. Up until ngize ngedanyani-ke ngabuya ngasazitheshisi zonke lezi. Hayi CWP ngiyayibonga yona iyasipana kakhulu, and ngokwazi ukubekezela uzobona ama-changes umuntu amanokhona la.
Ndlela le ubafana change ngayo ngihleli la 4 years ukuthi mayebuya uthole kungananisi la endlini. Ngithola ubafana la endlini masengezele 2 room. Angikhumbuli kune complain la endlini. uNkulunkulu muhle mkhulu ngiyambonga. Owenza ubafana ukuthi makahlangane nale CWP ikakhulu wena ngoba uhlela umqaqazelo utshentshe le ndlela namangithusa ngayo. Ekuseni mangilele ubafana ungenzela itiye isinkwa what is ever sinayo sidle athi mawe sengiyahamba manje ngeskill center.
CWP for umphakathi mina ngifuna isize le ntwana lezithu zinyawo phela. Most yazo ziyasokola and ngina zikhawateka ziyabhora, umphakathi uyazilwisa namaphoyisa ayikho into yenzayo. Ngifuna nje CWP one of the good days emaplanini nami ukuthi mengabantu bazamela nje rehab or center esingakhona ukuthi thina njengoba sisipana kuyo sikwazi ukuthi sibavalele la, sibagayele all help nazo abayinidayo, sibancinise nangesipana.
Challenge nginalo ukufuna ngone CWP ila lokushini skill center yabona manje challenge nginalo ngathi amagenge ngikuthi ngingayini ithanele la nginethalela ku agriculture yini, and then ngaphusha ukuthi maybe sinregister le company yethu sin organize le company yethu sinifishele nje into ezinjalo nangayikhiphe lokushini nangazi ngivule isomisikhambi yabona.
Mina bhuti wami ngathi ngikhulumela abanye kwelami isayidi, hayi mina bhuti wami ngizimisele.
Uyabona
nawe as my brother you have ukuthi wena uziphushe uzifake entweni, uyabona nathi vele sizokuthalisa ukuthi my brother sihambe, uyabona umntwana vele ngithi uma sasemncane uma sehasa, uyabona uyambamba maybe uyabona bese nini uma kuyeka bese ugcina manje awela phansi asukume futhi ugcine sekahamba ngasahamba ngamadoda. Nathi singabantu lapho ukuthi sifuna ukukhetha kini, uyazisa. So into ephuma ku decision ikuwe, sizokutshela na uthatha decision but i-action mele ukuthi iphume ikuwe umuntu osifuna ukuwenza i-action kakhulu ikuwe.
Kadi drugs bathola batho ba bangata Orange Farm ba tsubang di drugs, so le CWP renal partnership le sanka, so ha re etsa di awareness re ba kaofela, and then ra khona ya dikolong go bua le bana ka di drugs, ra khona go bua le community ka di drugs. Crime ya rona ya thewa haholo ha re sebetsa le CWP because goba easy for rona gore go bua le community. It's very important to re address crime before e etsahala, so ho etsa di awareness go tsamaya ka ntle o jetsa batho gore ba ske ba etsa 1 2 3 e ba easy for rona.
we registered recently an NPO, which is headed by also Big Boy. It is called Step Up. The Step Up program, it's also going to be dealing with drug issues, where we are saying not only the CWP people must step up, but the community and government must step up in fighting this dreaded habit. We worked with SAPS in this regards, assisting CWP and say, how do we make sure that the community trusts us? We worked with the Department of Correctional Services in reintroducing them back, integrating them back into the community. But that we said they must do some community work whereby they show that they want to give back to communities.
Yes!
We are whistleblowers to SAPS in terms of crime, because we are community based, we are rooted on the ground, we know where are these things happening.
Every Wednesday we go out for the awareness and do the door-to-door with the CWP. So it is easy for us because batsiba hore crime e etsahala kae hangata. So go ba simple for bona hore re tswe ka ntle re bue le batho ka domestic violence, rape, missing person, hona le batho le drugs.
So the Step Up program is also part of CWP program.
City drugs, crime not cool, don't be a fool. When you are cool, you end up in prisoner. When you are cool, you end up eating with other communities. Crime not cool, don't be a fool. Amen. Amen. I'm sorry.
And we as the police, we are appreciating what they are doing, which means that we are seeing the reduction of crimes.
What I love about the people that we work with, they work, let me say, they work beyond the call of duty.
I saw strong people, positive people that are willing to work, willing to go out.
I mean, you have leaders who are like highly visionary, like in terms of what they want to see, in terms of the achievements of like CWP. But I guess also the city of like Joburg, like as a municipality, it is playing like an important role in supporting CWP.
We have a sustainable partnership, of which it should not even fail, with the city of Johannesburg.
So they actually become our referrals. Like if there's a case that needs a social worker, then they actually come to our center and say, we need assistance in this particular case, in a social problem.
What I can tell you here in Orange Farm, yes, I can confirm that they are doing a lot. 8 years, it's a long time being here. For them, maybe I can say for the past 5 years out of that 8 years, maybe they were not getting anything.
Then we started programs with the city to say, can't we operate as CWP, the information desk? We have young people that have completed matric in CWP. If you go into other areas, young people don't want to be associated with CWP. They feel the only thing that we do in CWP is going to clean dumping sites. We do career development, we do career advices with the Department of Education into the different schools, City of Johannesburg every year. we do a career exhibition.
City of Joburg and CWP, they work hand in hand in programs. Even now, we are working them in with Pick It Up to identify the, the dumping site, where we come and clean that site and say to the people, whoever wants to occupy the site, this is the period that you're going to be doing. You're going to have, we call it the food for waste. You're going to get a food parcel for a particular period until that land is in a state that they are now starting to sell. Then they exit the program.
Di better tse ding se re plantile some seeds la di so hlai mo di seeds tsena. They are trimming some beds. My name is Lerato Pule. I'm a Hot One coordinator. Ngisebenzela is
So thank you so much. Thank you to Vanessa and Hugo. We're going to spend 5 minutes, if it's okay. All right. So I'm going to use this opportunity, Vanessa and Hugo, if you don't mind, just to sit up front to take any questions, comments, and feedback and requests for clarification from fellow participants. We'll take about 3 or 4, and then they will respond. Yes.
Sorry, I needed to outsource the microphone. My name is Nyabira Ben, Katiba Institute, Kenya. I have a question on the sustainability of the activities that you do. My question then is, what happens after the funding or the activities that you're doing currently is over? How do you ensure the sustainability?
Okay. Thank you. Any other? Yes.
Thanks. Hugo, I was interested by the focus on drugs, and I was just wondering if alcohol was included as the offering. It seemed like a lot of attention on illicit drugs. Thanks.
Okay. Yes.
I would want to know, how did you engage the different groups? How did you, what approaches did you use to get to women, men, girls, and boys?
Both of you. One last one. Okay, so we have 3 questions, and you can take either that you think applies to your case. So we'll start with Vanessa.
I wasn't quite sure whether you were asking about sustainability of our research or the programs we covered. Yes, okay. Well, VPUU is being rolled out to a number of different areas in the Western Cape, and I think they even thought about expanding it to other areas of the country. I mean, it is very resource intensive, and it's got a lot of funding from the German Development Bank. So in some ways, the city handed over part responsibility for implementing the upgrading. So whether it's sustainable in the long term, I'm not actually sure. Probably my colleague Richard would even be able to tell you more about that.
So I think he's asking in terms of you as HSRC running the program.
Okay. Well, I mean, the project was funded as under the Safe and Inclusive Cities program with funding for a 3-year intervention. So, maybe I'm not misunderstanding your question again.
Sorry, I needed to be clearer than I was. I'm talking about the sustainability of the outcomes of the projects. Like, we want communities to engage, to begin engaging, doing activities together. Once the project is over, how do we ensure that that engagement continues and such? Like, are we creating a leadership structure at the local level? Or are we doing something similar to that?
And I think just to answer that in relation to CWP, CWP is anticipated as a permanent program. That at the moment it's present in around 250 locations across the country, and they're expanding that to further locations, so upscaling it. And essentially, it's in some places it is the idea is to kind of have offshoots where it develops projects that then become independent. Like they talked about cooperatives and establishing NGOs that can employ people. So there is a certain sense that it is supposed to kind of encourage further local sustainability. But ultimately, and I think the challenge was also that this was initially anticipated as something people would temporarily stay in until they find work. But the nature of kind of employment in South Africa at the moment is if you're unskilled, the chances of finding work are very small. So people stay in this program over a long-term period. I think just quickly in terms of the drugs and alcohol, these programs are very much respond individually to local situations. And at the moment, there's limited national support to kind of develop programs in a more professional way. So in a sense, these are kind of totally local inventions of how to deal with drugs, how to deal with alcohol in each situation. And I think the fantastic thing about places like Orange Farm is they develop partnerships with people like SAICx, which is a kind of drug and alcohol prevention center that's national. So where we can develop those linkages where they can kind of provide more effective interventions rather than reinventing the wheel every time. I think we're excited about that.
Yes, I mean, maybe to quickly go back to the question of sustainability, I think one of the major shortcomings of the VPUU program is that basically they created their own parallel structure to manage the program as well, instead of actually working through existing structures. So I think in the long term that's going to be problematic, because when VPUU stops actively managing those forums, I'm not sure what's going to happen. I mean, in terms of engaging with different sectors in the community, we went through kind of very much a traditional process of going into the community and getting to know the key stakeholders. And then from there, you saw Ntsedo spent a lot of time in Khayelitsha. So he got to know the area very well, the people living there and the different role players. So it was, a classic kind of snowball methodology where we try and access more and more sectors of the Khayelitsha community over time.
JP Smith from the City of Cape Town. So perhaps just around the issue of sustainability first. VPUU was originally a very budget-intensive program. So it was unsustainable for two reasons. One, it was enacted by an external entity. It was created by, run by a specialist entity with town planners and various experts populated on it, which meant you could only do a few, 1 or 2 nodes at a time. So you would never get far-reaching results across the city with it. The second was it was very budget intensive and relied heavily on donor funding. So the intention was always to phase VPUU out after phase 3. And when VPUU moved to phase 4 with province, where they started to implement elsewhere in the province, we created an alternative structure called MERP, the Mayor's Urban Regeneration Program, because we're super good at creating really bad acronyms. And that is now in 11 nodes. It's slightly less budget intensive, and on the issue of sustainability, it works through an area coordinating team, which was in VPUU called the Safe Node Action Committee, or various other names or stakeholder groupings. So you're still compiling some kind of action plan, but you're doing it through the area coordinating team in conjunction with the local sub-council, so you pull them right in, so your political leadership and your area depots and everything are right involved. And the implementing budget is both specialized and reserved for MERP, centrally funded, but also comes from line function budgets. So there is a more sustainable long-term version of it. And then on the issue of CWP, one of the things that bedeviled CWP, and I went to go sit at the HSRC's assessment of CWP, was the lack of legacy benefits. In other words, we weren't developing long-term skills. So we've heavily invested in EPWP, the Extended Public Works Program, and if there was more time, I think there's something to be said for how you develop legacy skills. One of the programs we've pushed EPWP all the way to including a form of law enforcement officer paid for by EPWP, which is actually working quite well. And about 3/4 of the guys who are on that EPWP program will, within the first 12 to 24 months, find full-time employment within the law enforcement fraternity. So there, the skills benefit that they get translates into full-time employment. But you're right, a lot of people get trapped at those kind of employment opportunities if there's no skills development.
I think this does it for this session. So I'd like to extend a very intense appreciation to Vanessa and Hugo for really sharing critical insights from different cities, but also with similar experiences, different models of approaching issues of social cohesion and violence prevention. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much again to our presenters. So I'd like to, we'll move directly into the first of 4 talk shows. So we're using quotation marks around that, because unfortunately we don't have Oprah Winfrey or Jerry Springer with us today. But we do have some really dynamic presentations or conversations rather, to further engage you, and really we do want this to be a conversation. So please, it will be a little bit structured at the beginning, but following that there will be lots of time to engage. So I really encourage you to think back on those questions that you had from yesterday that you didn't get a chance to ask, or that occurred to you overnight and you woke up thinking, I really need an answer to this question. And so while we'll just move straight into that. Our first talk show is on gender transformation in cities. So if I could please invite Nausheen Anwar, Tatiana Moura, Yalaili Das, Caroline Moser, and Dina Musundarwezo to please approach the podium or the stage and take your seats. And I will hand things over to Dina, who's serving as our host, and will be interviewing our guests before we open things up for questions. And if for those who are watching on the webcast, if you have questions, we are keen to hear them. Please either ask them via Twitter using the hashtag SAICx2017, or post them in the comments on the YouTube feed, and we'll have somebody who's collecting those, and we'll post them, and we'll be sure to incorporate those from our online guests.
Good afternoon. So my name is Dina Musundarwezo, and I'm going to be the host for the talk show this afternoon. So you're welcome. And with me in the studio, I have different experts on different topics, specifically around gender transformation in cities. Some are researchers, some are practitioners, and some are both. So we have Nashin Anwar, who works with the Institute of Business Administration in Pakistan. I will ask my guest to wave when I say your name. And the second expert is Taitana Moula, who is working with Promondo in Brazil. The other expert with me is Yele Da, who works with Plan India. The last, definitely not least, is Caroline Moser, who is from and working with University of Manchester in the UK. Okay, great. So you are welcome. So, like I said, our topic today is focusing on gender transformation in cities. From yesterday and from this morning, it has been extremely clear that the issues affecting people in the cities are not gender neutral. They do affect women and men differently, and other genders differently. We know that also in terms of, looking at the issues, whether it is issues around infrastructure, whether it is issues around planning, whether it is issues around service delivery within the cities, the way those are accessed has gender, but not just gender in terms of men and women, but also how it intersects with, whether it is social class, whether it is issues of, the inequalities. And, the discussion this afternoon is actually going to focus on those issues, specifically looking at the gender relations between men and women and other genders, and how we transform not the gender poor relations, but also the systems and structures that continue to entrench and actually continue to increase gender inequalities in the cities. So I'm going to start with you, Nashin. Can you start by telling us in just 3 minutes, the work that you have been doing around transforming gender in the cities?
Thank you very much. I think for quite a few of you, this will begin to sound very repetitive, so I apologize. And I'll try and home in on specific issues that perhaps I haven't covered already, pertaining to the project that I've been involved in the last 3 years. I cannot make any claims as such to having engaged myself in productive ways whereby I have transformed gender relations in Pakistan, in urban Pakistan, and specifically in the cities in which I've been working alongside my partners, but I can home in on a couple of key issues pertaining to the relationship between certain types of infrastructure and gender itself. So one of the things that we've tried to understand, to investigate and understand in our project is that what kind of a relationship do men and women have with infrastructure? And we see it as a relationship, rather than just seeing infrastructure as some kind of a thing or some kind of an object and just sort of leave it at that, because infrastructure often has certain kinds of symbolic values, and it is always contextualized in terms of relationships, right? So, for instance, a very quick example is water supply. So water supply is an issue, where issues of supply and accessibility of both good quality water and just water in a very simple sense is a challenge for the vast majority of cities across Pakistan. And in this instance, we're only looking at 2 cities that everybody knows about, Karachi and then the twin cities of Rawalpindi, Islamabad. We haven't even gotten into the dynamic of secondary cities and the vast majority of peri-urban settlements and new types of settlements that are emerging in which there are tremendous infrastructure disconnects. So across urban Pakistan, and specifically in the cities that we've investigated, water supply is a huge problematic. And water supply, or the lack of water supply, and especially the lack of good quality water supply, is something that affects all classes and all neighborhoods across both cities. But the issue becomes particularly disruptive and challenging when we start looking at low-income settlements. So this issue of infrastructure, men and women class, and then there is a whole issue of ethnicity, which I won't even get into because it's such a huge problematic, especially in places like Karachi. So the nexus of these different dynamics, right, they become very important in terms of this relationality aspect. So one particular neighborhood in which we worked was Orangi Town, which some of you might know about, many of you won't. It's considered one of the largest squatter settlements or slums in South Asia. Its counterpart could be Dharavi in Mumbai. And Orangi Town is a settlement of almost 3.5, 4 million people. I always say that's like almost the size of the city of Singapore, right, in terms of population. And vast tracts of Orangi Town have severe water supply disconnection problems. And there's a very sort of complicated history as to why this water supply disconnectivity exists. It has to do with governance failure to a certain extent, budgetary constraints, Karachi's own political economy, so on and so forth. So a very large terrain of this water supply disconnect has been filled by these so-called water mafias. And the word mafia is very misleading because they're not actually mafias as such. They're not entities that operate outside the boundaries of the state or the ambit of state authority. They're very much linked with the state. So these water mafias supply water into a vast majority of the low-income settlements in Orangi Town. And they charge exorbitant prices for providing water. So typically, in certain settlements in Orangi Town, buying water can take up 30% of your household income. And if you're a low-income family and your household income, ranges anywhere from 10 to 15,000 rupees per month to a maximum 25,000 rupees, which is typically what we found. I mean, that's a big chunk of your income that gets invested in water supply. And then water supply provision is very, very uneven because when these spaces become securitized or paramilitary forces intervene for a wide variety of reasons, then the burden on men and women becomes incredibly very, very extreme. So in some of our case studies, we found, for instance, that when the paramilitary operations were launched in 2015 to supposedly securitize Karachi, in these specific spaces, water supply from even the private tanker services virtually disappeared because these private tanker services were regarded as, entities that were linked to the Taliban or the terrorist operations, which was not the case. So these were literally, so water supply, the provision of water supply into these neighborhoods was literally shut off. So the burden on women and men increased in exponential ways. And typically what we found was that men had to go to search for water supply because on women there were certain constraints that women of a certain age can't get out of the house, they can't go and search for water. So the burden fell on the men. And this became a terrain of tremendous conflict, often escalating into issues of violence. And often this issue of searching for water, finding cheap access to water, and then finding water that is of good quality spilled into a kind of cut across the public-private terrain in complex ways and fed into issues of domestic violence. And in our report, we go, we provide case studies, we go at tremendous length, where we talk about this issue of vulnerability and violence, and this whole relationality issue between infrastructure, men and women, and then also the issue of ethnicity that works into this, whole terrain in very perverse and complex ways, but set within specific kind of political economies. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I do think that, I think what you have said is really important in terms of how also just the circumstances have somehow disrupted the gender roles, because everything we have read and experienced, some of us, is that it's the women who fetch water, right? At least to the majority of societies and communities. But then we're hearing that, in this specific circumstance, then men were the ones going to fetch water, but also how that then starts to escalate into violence in the domestic sphere. So I'm going to turn to Tatiana. So Tatiana, in terms of the work we are doing with the Promondo, I know that you focus a lot on transforming masculinities, to ensure that we achieve gender power relations. Can you tell us more about that work and how it interfaces with transforming gender in the cities?
Sure. Promundo works to prevent gender-based violence with a focus on promoting nonviolent masculinities. And so one of the things that we tried to do with research under the Safe and Inclusive Cities program was to go beyond the obvious and the stereotypes. So being from Rio de Janeiro, Promundo, Rio sometimes is known by its stereotypes, being samba, football, and the urban violence, the gang violence there. So what Promundo tries to do is to go beyond those stereotypes and try to understand why men don't engage in violence, and that's what we try to do with this research. So we try to establish links between gender-based violence that occurs at the domestic sphere with urban violence in the public sphere. And so we consider this kind of research disruptive and feminist, of course, because it allows us to think transformative approaches, gender norms transformative approaches that we've been developing for 20 years now. And so one of the interesting things that we found out as a result of this research project, and an area that we've been focusing on, is that, for example, working to promote fatherhood and caregiving can be considered an issue of public security. How and why? Because we think that we need to advocate for men as caretakers as much as we advocate for women in leadership, for example. Because based on our research, we know that there are intergenerational transmissions of violence, but if we can talk about that, we can also talk about intergenerational transmissions of non-violence and care. And so I think that promoting 50% or that men do 50% of unpaid care work, and it's a matter of economy, it's a way of achieving the gender revolution, or to transform gender relations. And so that's one of the examples of the work that Promundo has been doing. So developing feminist and gender transformative research, and using that research to develop gender transformative methodologies and public policies.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely, that really sounds transformative. So I'm going to turn it to Ilaile from Plan India. I know that your focus has mainly been on young women and specifically girls. And so can you please also tell us about your work and how it is transforming gender in the cities?
Thank you, Dina. Safer Cities for Girls with Plan International essentially speaks about safety and inclusiveness of young children, young boys and girls, young adults, and primarily the group of people who are assumed that they are sort of coming up tomorrow, and then leadership and negotiation skills are still, they need to be further buttressed. And what we've been doing in the program is essentially grooming them, empowering both young girls as well as young boys to work together to make public spaces safer. It is much required to invest in the infrastructure capital to ensure that gendered spaces are accessible to all. However, it is also much required to sort of empower and create that entire social capital with the young people, and so that they intervene in such cases, they are empowered to deal with such cases, and they are able to retract back from saying that I want to be a part of this violence, I don't want to be a part of this violence. So that is essentially what we do through our curriculum modules of Champions of Change. These are essentially action modules that we work through with young girls and boys to take them on this journey. And supplementing this is a lot of, it's not per se defined research, but it's definitely research for them when they do safety audits of their communities to assess how they perceive that safety, how they perceive girls and boys safety, and then they take that auditing process to interface and dialogue with policymakers and lawmakers to essentially arrive at solutions. So the entire cycle of violence in public spaces is broken when you have a set of people who are able to break out from that mold and who are able to say that I don't want to be part of it, and that is primarily what our program does.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ilaile. So I'm going to turn to Caroline. Caroline, we know that you have published a lot in terms of, the focus on gender and cities. And I would like you to share with the audience the work that you have been doing around gender in the cities and how, you have been working around transforming gender power relations.
Thank you very much. A long time ago in the 1980s, with colleagues at the Development Planning Unit, we invented something called gender planning. because we really felt strongly that planners, transport planners, land use planners, all the planners, would put women in as an add-on. So that was a long time ago, and since then things have changed a lot, and we've moved to gender mainstreaming. But what happened, I felt, with the UN Habitat 3 coming up and the new urban agenda, was that we had the opportunity to really have a really fundamental paradigm shift as well on the issue of gender. So for me, the first thing was to work out, what do we mean by transformation? And actually, the interesting thing about transformation is it's an incredibly popular term. You might have heard young Klaus use it this morning. Transformation is used everywhere, by everybody, so it becomes a meaningless term. And I think the first thing for me was to work out, well, what do we actually mean by it? And in the sense that it is an inherently political act, and it is closely associated with structural changes in power relations. So that was a really important thing to really work out. And then following on from that, to really start thinking, how do we move beyond gender mainstreaming, which since Beijing 1995 has been the dominant gender policy endorsed by the UN system and implemented across the world by governments, and been very effective as far as it goes. Now, gender mainstreaming has it's twin track. One part is about integrating men and women equally into everything, and the other track is around empowerment. So I sort of thought, well, let's start thinking, what's the difference between gender empowerment and gender transformation? And for me, there's a fundamental and very interesting difference. If we think about gender empowerment, as I say, it's mainly associated with gender mainstreaming, and it describes how individual women, through their agency, increase their bargaining power in public and private spheres to participate fully in economic and political life. And it's really well known. That is what gender empowerment is about. If we look at transformation, as I said, gender transformation, this is inherently a political act, and it's closely associated, as I said, with structural changes in gender power relations. And it emphasizes not individuals, but collective action. And in not only collective action, collective negotiation, collective contestation. And it's not a blueprint, and it's not a quick act, and it's something that takes a very long time to accomplish. And I'll just give you one very, very quick example to show you what I mean. There's a fantastic project in Brazil, in Recife, where you don't just empower women by giving them land rights, but you have a transformative change in power relations by changing the legislative procedures in planning processes. So that's the difference between individual empowerment and structural change. And I think that one of the challenges we have is that this is easier said than done. I think of transport and the way we make safe buses for women, or women-only carriages and things like this in cities across the world. That's protecting women. It's not changing gender power relations at all. It doesn't change the way that men necessarily behave on buses or trains. So it is a really quite fundamental shift. And I started to do this work recently. I'm very excited about it. And I think that there are a number of agencies that are now thinking about how would this really fundamental paradigm shift, what would it entail in terms of their own work?
Thank you so much for reminding us. You know that actually for us to achieve transformation, we have to look at not just individual empowerment and transformation, but structural transformation that goes beyond individual to the collective. So Titan, if I come back to you, what do you think about what Karen just said in terms of, the collective transformation? Sorry. It is in relation to what Karen just talked about in terms of transforming, transforming the structures that goes beyond just, transforming individuals. How do you relate with that in your work?
Yes, I mean, I fully agree with Caroline, of course. And although Promundo works at the community level, we usually do that to evaluate our pilot interventions, because in fact, we also do strongly believe that to transform gender norms and gender relations, you need to focus on the structure. So in order to do that, we work directly and we have close relations with the public education sector, with the health sector, with the justice system, with the public security system. So our theory of change includes working that at the community level, but also engaging public sectors and working directly with the government. So making policy recommendations and trying to put these structural issues on the public agenda. So that's the way Promundo works in Brazil and in the other countries where we have offices.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's perfect. You can give that to that side. Yeah, so Nasheen, again, to bring us to the, the practical side of this conversation, because often when we talk about transformation, it sounds something so huge, and we have also been told by Caroline that it's also really long term. But in practical terms, how do you see us achieving this also from the side of the cities? Yeah. How can the cities achieve this?
Yeah, thank you very much. I completely agree with both Caroline and Tatiana, who've touched on incredibly important issues, that this is a long-term engagement. Whenever we start talking about structural dynamics, it's always a long-term engagement. So Pakistan, where shall I start? So we have the legislation in place, on issues of sexual harassment and, rape. And I mean, there's been a series of legislations that have actually been put into place in the last 5 years, but nothing gets implemented, right? Because again, the cultural context becomes one particular dimension of this whole transformative aspect that slows down the process. So how do I see, in practical terms? For me, media is an incredibly important vantage point to engage with. So whilst it's much harder to deal with bureaucrats and policymakers who will turn around and say, oh, this is really sweet, oh, you work on women's issues, right? I mean, generally in Pakistan, that's how it's kind of, oh, you're working on gender? Oh, those are women's issues, right? And what are those issues? Well, generally speaking, a Pakistani bureaucrat, sitting in parliament or in Senate, or even in local government will have a very, very patriarchal attitude, we deal with women's issues, and it'll be somewhere, you go to the women's wing or the women's cell over there, and you can deal with it. So in the last 10 years, the mediascape in Pakistan has transformed in a major, major way, because the whole landscape has been deregulated. So whilst it's still a very fraught landscape, and it's a very conflict-ridden landscape, but it still provides, a very powerful way to kind of engage with these kinds of issues. And in fact, later on, in late August, my partners and I, my two other colleagues who can't be here with me over here today, who've been part of this project, we're actually going to be launching a very big, media campaign, and we are going to be targeting print media. That's going to be our first target, through which we want to make the vast majority of our findings, relatable, to put them out there. So I see the media as a very important terrain through which one can engage with issues of transformation. I'm not suggesting that the outcomes are guaranteed, but I think as an academic, at the end of the day, I can only aspire, and that's about it.
Yeah. So thank you, Nasheen. So coming back to you, in terms of the work that Plan is doing, and again bringing and sticking to the question around the city and how can make sure that the city is actually doing work that is gender transformative, what is that you have been doing as Plan to work with the city to achieve that?
Transformativeness, I feel, is essentially trying to balance the power imbalance that we've been having since centuries. So when you want to sort of right the balance scale, you have to have multi-stakeholder engagements. You can't work with a certain class of people and leave out the rest. So working with all the different, a lot of the people have been mentioned here, the government, the policymakers, the lawmakers, the media, the young children, the community. What I think adds another flavor, and what we've been doing, is working with the general public. It's likewise in India you do. Of course, I see a little larger penetration in terms of trying to balance and create equality and part of that, in their public legislation, but there is still that cadre, there is still that notion of, okay, fine, this is a human right, this is a women's right issue, this is a girls' rights issue, so this is an affirmative action that needs to be done. But beyond that affirmative action, if you're looking at transformative behavior, you have to have both sides of the coin coming together. So a lot of our work is also with the general public, trying to convert the bystanders into champions. Because we've also realized that when you're talking about violence and harassment on streets, many a times it is to everyone's advantage, and it is a great motivating factor if I'm out on the street and I know that if I face any harassment, there are people who will help me. Which unfortunately our research right now does not point at. We find bystander apathy to be one of the big cases, at least that we are facing in our programs on safer cities. So that is one critical angle that we need to work with, not only with people in closed spaces, with different policymakers, lawmakers and different groups, but also the general public who hasn't bought into the whole safe city concept yet.
So yeah, thank you so much, Ilile, for that. So Karen, coming back to you and drawing from your rich experience, I mean, I have read your work, I've admired your work before I met you, and I'm so honored to sit with you on this show. So drawing from your experience, can you, tell the audience what you have seen as, the three most inspiring examples of gender transformation interventions and what you think makes them transformative? Gender transformative?
Well, I think that's a really difficult question. But I think, you see, it's very interesting. Today we have quite a number of people from South Africa. And if you look at the post-apartheid housing policy that was implemented and really accessed 50% of houses to women in women's names, you could ask yourself, was that a transformative policy? And in many senses it was. I would argue, and some of you may say it wasn't transformative, so what is a transformative policy? The interesting thing, of course, is that nothing's neutral. And there has, I know, there's been research showing that, of course, there was terrific backlash, actually in terms of violence, because women acquiring homes caused male members of the family to want the home because the titling caused conflicts with partners, whether they were married or civil partners or whatever. So, transformation is not a neutral activity. So the South African example for me is fascinating because it just shows that it can be top down. And I think it's interesting to see and to hear from South Africans who know this better than I do, how far it's been successful. Just very quickly to contrast that, because for me, working as an urbanist, the bottom line is housing. Housing is the first asset everybody wants, in my opinion. And a lot of my work, I relate to an asset framework. Which are the assets? Is it physical capital? Is it social capital? What sort of assets? And housing is the asset in my own research that people want before anything else. So I think another example, which hasn't come up that much, but we did talk a little bit about it in one of the smaller sessions, and I think Jane Weru tomorrow may relate to it, is the global experience of slum dwellers, shack dwellers international, which doesn't specifically have a gender transformational framework, but works bottom up, mobilizing around collective accessing land, negotiating with government, negotiating with the private sector, not inquiring land as an entitlement, but through a negotiation process. So I think that one should be clear that there's not a one-way mechanism of reaching transformative outcomes. They are long-term, and I just go back to my original example from Brazil. It's a remarkable story of an organization, a feminist organization, working with local partners. It took them 9 years to contest and to finally get the legislation changed. And the problem that a lot of organizations have dare I say it, is that we work in a world where donors want quick fixes and quick results. And this isn't what happens under these sort of transformative ways. But I am incredibly optimistic after a long period of feeling rather negative, because I think empowerment is just so focused on the individual woman. And if the individual woman makes it, and the individual woman gets economic activities going, or the individual woman, it's all up to her. And I think it isn't up to her. It's up to much wider structures of power relations. And that's why I think, for me, this is a very, very positive way forward. And I hope that this is something that people can take forward from this type of meeting and think more about. And I want to thank Jennifer, because she came to my session that I did at UN Habitat, and she said, yeah, we need to have a session on gender transformation. So thanks, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think what you talk about in terms of, our tendency, to focus on, short-term quick wins, and individuals as opposed to the systems, I think is also what is causing what we're experiencing as, losing gains. That, we get gains here because they are quick, they are just individual focused, and before we know it, we start losing them because we have not actually prepared the ground well enough to ensure that those gains are sustained and they are passed on from generation to generation. So I'm going to turn to the audience. If you have any questions or contributions, you are going to raise your hand. I hope there's a roving mic in the audience. And you state your name and ask your question or make a comment. So by show of hands. Sorry? We can use the microphones on the table as well. And make sure you use the mic. Okay, so I'm going to start from this side. We have one hand here, and I'll give you a number. 1, 2, 3. So we'll start with 3.
So thank you very much. My name is Charlotte. I'm from Ghana. My question goes to Tatiana. I hope I'm right. Yeah. Thank you very much for your presentation and your work that you are doing on fatherhood, promoting fatherhood, if I'm right. I'm just curious. I'm trying to figure out whether in your work you are facing any challenge in terms of resistance, because sometimes the resistance is not from the men, but from women themselves. So if you are facing any resistance, how are you trying to address that? Thank you.
Number 2.
Is that me? Okay, I think it's me. Thank you very much. I think it was a fantastic presentation as well. My question is more on the gender transformation concept. I find it fascinating. But I'm wondering how we can achieve that in an environment like the one we have in Africa, where in the urban settings, there is still a gender segregated labor force, where women are still heavily working in the informal sector and receiving very low pay when compared to their male counterparts. And if the idea behind gender transformation goes with economic empowerment to an extent, I'm wondering from your experience how you've managed to marry the two. The fact that there is a high urban group of women who are relying on agriculture in most cases, but more so in the informal sector that is not regulated, that cannot allow them to get that transformative leap which you have clearly talked about. And then this idea of empowerment, social empowerment and political empowerment that to an extent should also undermine or underpin the transformation. I was just wondering from all of you where you come from, how you've managed to play these two and how you've managed to get these women in the informal sector to transform themselves and become the leaders that you're talking about.
Thank you. And there was number 3.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Mohamed Kane, and I'm from Sierra Leone. My comment in line with, or question specifically, in line with gender transformation in the city. I have read almost all of the laws that are governing, that are around gender issues. Why is it that most of these things are just giving premium to specifically women and girls and forgetting about the male folks? Because at the end of the day also, let's don't forget there is also another recent trend where we now have people who are part of the LGBT community. And those people are as well significant in terms of development. What are the focus also towards that in ensuring that indeed we have a transformative system in terms of gender in the cities? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to come this side. So I'm moved on to this side. Oh, okay, all right. If that's the preferred format, that's fine. I'll come back to the panel. So, do you want to go first? Okay.
So thank you, Charlotte, for your question. It's an interesting question, but Promundo is not, we don't provide services and we don't work on a daily basis with community. So as I was saying, we run pilots and we evaluate our methodology, but we are not at the community on a daily basis. But that said, I can give you some examples about resistance from the women's groups that we work with. So we have several kinds of resistances in Brazil, and let me focus in Brazil. So one of the main resistances is from a specific part of the feminist movement in Brazil. So focusing and working on masculinities and doing that as a way of preventing violence sometimes is not considered as part of the feminist agenda. So, but we know, and me, myself as a feminist, of course, I joined the debates, and we know that that results a lot from funding. And so when funding, international funding flows, when they go to the masculinities work, it is withdrawn from the feminist and the women's movement. So it's something that we need to work with. So convince donors to make the two worlds dialogue and connect. When we have specific women's economic empowerment projects and we try to engage men discussing unpaid care work, for example, we see a certain degree of resistance from the women's side. Only when we have projects that focus on women's economic empowerment by engaging men and boys and discussing unpaid care work. But the major resistance that we have right now in Brazil is the government. So we have an illegal government, a really conservative government, and all the gender agenda is suffering backlash. And so, for example, to give you an example, you cannot talk about gender in public schools now because it's considered ideology, and you cannot discuss ideology in schools. So the major resistance to the feminist movement in Brazil, being women's movement or the work that we do with masculinities, violence prevention, is from the government side. So that's something that we need to be creative to overcome. Thank you.
Anyone else to respond?
Yeah, I just to respond to show you how fragile this is by the example that we've just had from Brazil, because what I didn't mention in my presentation was the extraordinary importance of women in political positions. And Brazil has always been a wonderful example to me of women very strategically deciding to work at the municipal level. And so enormous amounts of women working in municipal government. Would you agree with me? And so you see it's so fragile, it can so easily change. And that's why I think it's very important, your comment about the role of the state. I mean, we're meant to be having a conversation, aren't we? So it's as important to respond to that. I just want to make one other comment. I think we haven't talked enough about masculinities, and I think think that's very, very important, and I apologize again for that. And actually, it reminds me that there's a wonderful project within this one in Mozambique. And the Mozambique project is really about the disempowerment of men coming back from war and what happens to them. And I think that there is an extraordinary area where we need to look at transformation in post-conflict contexts in different ways, in all sorts of different ways, depending on the context where we're working. That is a fantastic project. I know it's linked with yours. And it's very powerful in terms of trying to understand from a masculinities and masculine identity and what happens to men, and that the transformative nature of what happens to men is as important, and we need to say it. Final comment, just very, very quickly. The whole issue of the informal economy and men and women in it is very tough and very difficult. But again, there are really interesting organizations like WeGo, which is a worldwide network of women working informally that works across the world in different countries, and what it really does is challenge local municipal government around planning legislation, traders legislation, all the types of legislation that can fundamentally affect women as informal sector workers who are often really very disadvantaged in terms of the men that they're competing with in many of these sectors. So I don't have an answer. I fully agree with you that the labour market, the informal sector, etc., is very difficult. But again, we have wonderful examples of organizations that are out there working on these sorts of issues, and it's tapping them and the long-term work that they are doing that I think is helpful for us.
Can I? Yeah, thank you. But also maybe just to add on, the issue around labor market and women working in the informal sector, I think transformation can actually happen if we start looking at issues of unpaid care work, because it's often that, when women are constantly doing majority of the unpaid care work, that they also find themselves, concentrating in that sector and not really having the opportunity to move on to, to the formal sector. But also within cities and governments, are there policies that actually do support and facilitate women to move from the informal to the formal and facilitate them? Nashin?
Yes, thanks very much. I just wanted to, in conversation with the gentleman who pointed out about legislation, I just want to sort of flag that it's also so context-driven. And while I agree with his point that legislation should address, issues concerning not only women but also men and transgenders and generally the LGBT community, can never say that word properly. So I just want to sort of give the example of Pakistan, right? And so in Pakistan, this question of violence against women is a particularly important one, because the political economy question is a very important, challenging issue. So over the last 35 years, 75 years, 70 plus years, we've witnessed 3 intense military regimes. And with each military regimes, we've seen the intensification of the process of Islamization, and how certain legal edicts have been sort of manipulated and maneuvered in very strategic ways to legitimize military governments. And specifically in the 80s, under the government of General Ziaul Haq, which time period in which Pakistan saw a very intense phase of Islamization, certain Islamic edicts such as the Hudud ordinances were taken up and they were made mainstream, right? And this was a very important piece of Islamic legislation. I mean, it's debatable the extent to which it even is Islamic. And the Hudud ordinances, for instance, have to do with rape. And they have to do with how, if a woman is raped, she needs to produce 3 witnesses to be able to make a legitimate claim that she was raped. So the Hudud ordinances have set back the women's agenda so much in Pakistan, and we are constantly fighting this issue of how do you get the Hudud ordinances revoked. This is the damage done by General Ziaul Haq's regime of militarization, which really found its, means of, power. This was during, the first Afghan war, Pakistan fighting America's proxy war and all of that, and this whole issue of Islamization and militarization really kind of, coming together, and the sort of the control over women's bodies then becoming a very, very important issue, especially through legislation. So in the last 15 years, there's been
quite a bit of debate in Parliament to really revoke the Hudud ordinances. But every time the debate begins, you have certain Islamic parties who may not have enough power through vote bank politics, but in Parliament they're able to assert their power. So every time certain liberal agendas are put on the forefront to revoke the Hudud ordinances, you have certain powerful Islamic parties who come to the forefront and say, no, you can't, right? And then they launch into all kinds of fatwas that, yes, a man can, hit a woman as long as it's gently and quietly within the household. I mean, there have actually been these kinds of fatwas launched. So, when we start talking about legislation and then when you contextualize it and you begin to see the enormity of the situation vis-a-vis women and violence, especially in a country like Pakistan, then yes, other issues like violence against men, against transgenders, that also needs to be taken into consideration. But this issue becomes an incredibly important one.
I just want to add two points essentially. For this entire conversation, I do agree with all of my panelists here. One thing which I feel, the first thing is education. Lack of a proper formal education sometimes prevents women from actually going too much or too ahead into the formal employment sector. So when you have a choice between a formal certified person and a man and maybe a not well certified female, there is always the chance that the man gets the job and continues to be. Secondly, we were talking about unpaid care leave. Women returning from maternity breaks often do not find conducive environments within the employment circle to stay back in their jobs. So many times you have them going back either to an informal sector or less paying job which has less hours, so that then she continues to take care of the child. I feel that you definitely need to work with both men and women to sort of solve this issue, but education could be a critical first step in going the long way.
Yeah, and education, the challenges just definitely the gender stereotypes of what men and women can do and what boys and girls can do, So I'm going to come to this side. I have one. You had your hand up. Have you changed your mind? Has it been answered? Okay, two. Anyone else this side? Okay, two. Please go ahead.
My name is Maysam Zarura. I'm with IDRC. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists and or talk show guests, sorry. And it's so great to see the research fitting so well into such relevant global debates. And my question is, I have two questions actually, two quick ones. Since we are looking at research and talking about research, can research itself be gender transformative? Especially, for example, at IDRC, we are a research organization and we are very much engaging with these issues and looking at how we can work to change these power structures through research. So can it be transformative? And if not in and of itself, to lead to gender transformation, what else is needed? The second question is maybe a bit more targeted at Caroline. Gender transformation is not a new issue. Why now? Why is it now something, and looking at masculinities in these power structures, what is it that is now happening or needed that so many organizations, donor organizations, etc., look and, government policies, why is it now that we are looking at this, and how can we take it back into policies, and especially since many of these structures are, need gender transformation in and of themselves?
Hello, my name is Eduardo Moncada from Barnard College, Columbia University. Thanks for all the presentations, really engaging stuff. And I had a question a little bit related to a previous question about sort of non-binary conceptualizations of gender, right? And so moving away from sort of thinking about legislation and kind of macro level, I'm just wondering, in the research that you all have done for either for SAIC or in the past, if you've come across any findings or generated findings about non-binary conceptualizations of gender and violence within the city, right? So I'm thinking about violence, sort of like hate crimes and other types of violence that are directed at people who don't fit into this binary of men, women, and how that's played out in some of the locales where you're doing research.
Any other question before I turn back to the panelists? Oh, okay. Please go ahead.
Hi. So I think if we're to take Caroline's point seriously about really moving to thinking about how gender fits within power relations, that I also think it's really important that we start moving away from just talking about women and men and girls and boys as generic categories and thinking about how gender overlaps and sex overlap with other kinds of identities, and particularly other forms of inequality. And I think sadly, because we're not doing that enough, it's actually undermining a lot of the kinds of strategies and approaches that and the kind of support that might actually work for, particularly for women from marginalised communities, for example. But it's a real challenge because, especially with, in a lot of parts of the world where sadly power relationships are deeply predatory and they're violent because they play into the hands of very powerful kind of groups that are quite difficult to challenge. There's a set of context in which this is really, needs really kind of nuanced and carefully thought through kind of approaches. So I'm kind of interested a bit in how you think we can do that better. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I'll come back to the panelist. Anyone wants to start? Okay, please.
Okay, thank you for your questions, Maysam. I'll start by yours. In fact, I'll focus on yours, if that's okay with you, the others. Now, first of all, I want to congratulate the SAIC program and IDRC for having this gender and urban violence panel yesterday and today, all women panel, and that's something that it's really disruptive. My colleague here from Plan, she was saying that she would love to have a man here talking about feminism. We have a lot in Promundo. Unfortunately, I'm here, but I represent the rest of the team. So, and regarding the question about can research itself be gender transformative, I think absolutely. I mean, we're talking about feminist research. And that's its main purpose, to ask different questions and to reach to different findings that can be disruptive. And so conducting feminist and transformative research can show us, for example, the relational aspects of gender and the intersectionality of gender, for example. It can also show us different scales where violence and non-violence occurs, and enables us to connect those scales. So I would say that we can include, for example, the micro scale and make that a matter of politics. So the personal is political. So for me, and I think for all this panel as feminists and doing research, I absolutely think that it's gender transformative. The major problem for me is what we do with research data. So, for example, now we had this program for 3 years. We have really beautiful data and lots of information, and we need to think what to do with that information, because it's frustrating to get all these data and not being able to think about public policies, programming, and other interventions that can be developed based on this, collectively, in fact. So.
These are very difficult questions, and particularly the ones about binary conceptualizations and the fact that gender transformation isn't new and so on. And the only thing I can answer is that I'm actually an urban anthropologist, and I've studied in the same community as an anthropologist living in that community in Guayaquil, Ecuador. If you look outside, I didn't say I came from England, I said I came from Ecuador, over 40 years. And there I have the capacity and have learnt to look at not all, but to really try and understand complexity. And complexity in terms of the sort of intersectionalities that you're talking about, the sort of issues. The problem is that if you also want to influence policy and you want to work on policy, you have to go from that complexity to you have to simplify it. And of course, then you get accused of being technocratic and instrumental. And this is a challenge I faced all my life on my work on gender, that at one level is highly complex, it's highly contextualized. It's not easy and it's not straightforward. But if you work with policy and policy interventions, you have to come up with recommendations that can be implemented. So, one answer is to say, okay, you've got to have everything at the local level. But if you want to really influence practice and how it changes, you do have to move up and simplify. And that's the tension you face, it's the contradiction you face, and it's the criticism you face. And you have to decide, okay, I think it's worth it. So I do it, but I'm fully aware, and I've had years of being criticized for doing it too, so I'm fully aware that you in order to give a very powerful message across, you do have to simplify. So your comment that gender transformation has been around for a long time, yeah, but I mean, I saw 14, 15 different versions of what it was. So I thought, okay, let's go for it. Let's use Habitat 3. Let's really say paradigm shift. They were using this language, but let's really, really unpack what it means for gender. So, okay, that's a political statement. Whether it's taken on board or not is another matter. So I appreciate these questions about complexity, but also the sort of reality of a global world.
But Caroline, if I can follow up on that, how do you make sure that even as you simplify the complex issues, they don't actually lose their meaning? How do you make that balance? Because I do understand the importance of simplifying for the purpose of, getting the relevant policies, for example, in place and all that. But how do you make sure you don't lose the meaning?
I don't think you can make sure. I think you just have to trust what you're doing and trust that there's a political message behind it and trust that people will take it on. The irony that happened with the gender planning work we did was that it was very popular in the 1980s and everybody wanted to be trained, and by the 1990s the feminists all said this is terribly technocratic and instrumental and we don't want to know anything about it, but the practitioners were still using it, because they needed simple tools and techniques to understand, roles, policy approaches, practical and strategic gender needs, and it continued. So they are different worlds in a way, and these worlds come together, and then they coincide at times, and then they fall apart at times. And I think the feminist agenda. Look at your example of the critique and the struggles with the feminist movement. We move in and out of these worlds, and I think we have to recognise that and take political responsibility for doing that.
Can I just add just one thing? Sorry, just one thing. I forgot your name. Sorry. About going beyond the binary research. So when we do images, it's the International Men and Gender Equality Survey. We also gather, and we've conducted images in more than 35 countries. We have lots of data, for example, on homophobia, attitudes, etc. So, and being in Brazil, you know that this year 57 transgender women were killed from the beginning of the year until now. So it's one of the countries where you have the highest levels of hate crimes related to trans people. So we have data on the images reports, and they are online if you want to check.
Yeah, I just very, very quickly want to say that often, when we think of is research gender transformative, I'm an academic, and frankly speaking, I consider myself the most powerless human being on this planet. And the only place where I feel I have a sense of power is in the classroom with my students, where I feel I can transgress. And that is a terrain in which I believe that research that deals with gender, that problematizes gender, in the ways that we've been talking about for the last 2 days, makes an enormous difference. And in the Pakistani context, I teach at a university in Pakistan, specifically based in Karachi, and I'm teaching a generation of young students who are in their 20s who've never dealt with the gender question, right? These are boys and girls of a certain age who are representative of a certain class, different classes coming from different parts of the city and different parts of Pakistan. So just being able to bring research into the classroom, both in a conceptual and an empirical sense, can be very destabilizing. You know, it's very, very destabilizing. And I think that gender transformative research isn't just about feeding into policy agendas, it's also about feeding into teaching programs. And I think that that is very, very important, and we don't even talk about that. And in a country like Pakistan, where the liberal arts tradition has been pretty much, you know, swallowed and subsumed by 3 incredibly powerful military regimes, because it was thought of as anti-military, anti-state, and you know, it was the liberal arts tradition is always considered as propaganda. And we are sitting now in a liberal arts school with a brand new liberal arts program, and we're constantly being watched. Being able to engage with gender issues, you know, is very transgressive, very empowering, and as much as I don't like that word, and very destabilizing. And that is something that I love to do. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so any final questions? Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, I have a kind of different off-the-curve question. So,
introduce yourself, please.
Oh, sorry. My name is Sheila Chugboju. I live and work here. I run a knowledge management consultancy. Anyway, so I lived and worked in Accra for 3 years, and Accra, Ghana, as you know, is a matriarchal society, and Accra is one of those cities that many people love because it's very safe, you know, in the spectrum of African cities, and we used to talk about that a lot, and people used to say, oh, it's because it's matriarchal. Matriarchal cities are so much safer because, you know, it's matriarchal. and that's, well, I don't know if there's any research to support that, so that's my question. And I wondered because I think it was you, Caroline, who talked about housing, being in housing and how you transfer housing, because in Ghana, men inherit through the female line, and so the power in terms of transferring land comes from the woman largely. So I wondered if that contributed to that. I've never read any research, so that's why it's sort of an off-the-curve question.
I want to relate that to your question about what could be the future work. I haven't got any answers for you. I know a little bit about Ghana, but it's not an area I've worked on. But we had posed to us what could be transformative research. And I think it is precisely these types of really, really fascinating examples, and they will be around the place, there are them. So we start to build up a real picture of what change can be like, but also incorporate some of the other issues around masculinities and other issues that have come in about binary and so on and so forth. All these types of issues. Great question. And I think it gives, you know, that's the food for thought about what the next generation of research can be about on this issue.
Yep. Thank you. Do we have any burning issues, questions before we wrap it up? Okay. I guess yes. We're on time, but I'm going to ask you if you have any, any closing remarks, point, even one point from any of the speakers. No? Okay. Yeah. Oh, Karen's last point was the closing one. Okay, great. So thank you so much. I think this has been really definitely enriching for me, and I hope for everyone else in this room. So thank you to the panelists that have really led these discussions, and for all of you for engaging in the conversation. Of course, we know that, this is just the beginning and not the end of this conversation. It will continue this afternoon, but also tomorrow and beyond, to ensure that actually, as we have heard, these are complex issues that are not going to be a one-off conference discussion, but are going to be built in all our conversations and dialogues, in our research and in our practices, that they will feed into not just
policies, but also our, our teaching programs and in our action that we do every day. But also I think gender transformation happens when we have an end in mind in whatever that we are doing, That is not enough that we are building roads, but we actually have in mind who is going to use that road and how that is going to improve the well-being of the person who is using this road and who is using that road in the first place. It cannot be one category of a person. It cannot be just a man or a woman. It has also to, think about the intersectionalities of people that live in that specific city. So thank you so much to all of you, to the organizers and the panelists.
Thank you again, everybody, for your engaging questions and commentary. And there's clearly this has raised some questions and challenges to us. There's a very compelling conversation going on Twitter if you want to join in. We have a half-hour break scheduled for now, so please take advantage of coffee, and we'll be back with the webcast in about half an hour, 30 minutes. Thank you.